It started in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, an old steel town built on smoke and grit, where the factory whistles marked time and the air stung your lungs with coal dust. In this hard-edged place, where toughness wasn't a choice but a survival skill, Edward Arthur Surratt was born in 1941. Outwardly, the Surratt family seemed comfortable. His father ran a successful local business, well respected in the community. People in town waved to him, shook his hand, called him a man of integrity. But behind the walls of their house, it was another story entirely, a world ruled by control, fear, and sudden violence. Edward learned very early how to move silently through rooms, how to disappear before the shouting started. He grew up not knowing what safety felt like, yet from the outside, he blended in seamlessly. Teachers saw a smart, well-behaved boy. Neighbors saw a polite kid mowing the lawn. But something dark simmered beneath that calm surface. By ninth grade, the shift became undeniable. He stopped caring about academics. He chose the streets over school books. Fights became his language, trouble his identity. In 1959, at just 18 years old, Edward was arrested for disturbing the peace. That same year, he was expelled from school for fighting. Though he managed to return and graduate, something inside him had changed forever. He didn't care anymore. Only days after graduation, he assaulted a police officer. Not a scuffle, not a heated argument gone too far. Witnesses said Edward struck with full, deliberate force, like a leash had been ripped off something violent inside him. The courts didn't go easy. He was sentenced to over a year in prison. But what he learned, there wasn't rehabilitation. It was survival in its rawest, ugliest form. Violence became routine. Manipulation became instinct. When Edward finally walked out of prison, his parents tried to intervene. They pushed him toward college, hoping structure might change him. It didn't. He dropped out by 1963, drifting between low-wage jobs, restless, bitter, and already dangerous. Then came the draft. In 1964, the U.S. Army took him in. Discipline should have reshaped him, but instead, Edward found new targets. He got into fights. He assaulted fellow soldiers. Eventually, he went AWOL. The army threw him out. 1 year later, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly. Edward was left with a failing business, unpaid debts, and a gnawing resentment that seemed to eat him alive. Desperate, he tried again. This time, he enlisted with the Marines. They sent him to the one place that would push him even further over the edge, Vietnam. The year was 1966. Edward Surratt was assigned to a tank unit during the Tet Offensive. What he saw there would break most men, bodies ripped apart by mortars, friends screaming as they bled out, limbs gone, eyes wide and unblinking in the mud. In 1969, a shell blast nearly killed him, severe chest trauma, a concussion, and a ruptured eardrum. He was patched up, awarded a Purple Heart and the Vietnamese Gallantry Cross, then sent home. But the real wounds weren't visible. The war didn't stay in Vietnam. It followed him. It lived in his head. Back in the U.S., Edward married and took a job as a long-haul trucker. On the surface, life looked stable. He lived in North Carolina. He drove freight. He had a home. But anyone close to him could see he was different, colder, distant, always on edge, as if he expected danger to come crashing through the door at any second. Then, in 1973, the darkness broke through completely. Edward tried to sexually assault a 13-year-old boy in Virginia Beach. He was caught, convicted in 1974, and sentenced to prison. But just 4 years later, in January of 1977, he was released. And that's when the nightmare began. Over the next 18 months, something terrifying swept across Pennsylvania, Ohio, South Carolina, and beyond. Couples were found murdered in their homes, sometimes in bed, sometimes in basements. Families were bludgeoned in the dead of night. Shotguns, baseball bats, bare hands. There was no pattern anyone could see. The killer struck fast, without warning, then vanished before police even knew where to start. In one home, David and Linda Hamilton were found beaten to death, their blood smeared across the walls like someone had painted with it. In another, Joseph and Catherine Weinman, an elderly couple, a disabled veteran and his wife, were discovered in their Pennsylvania home, bludgeoned beyond recognition. Catherine had been tied up and tortured before death. Joseph's face was destroyed by a baseball bat. The brutality was surgical, almost methodical. Then came William and Nancy Adams, found shot execution style in their bedroom. Guy and Laura Mills. Neighbors reported a foul smell days later. Police forced the door open to find them decomposing on the floor. Joel Kruger, ambushed in his own yard. Frank Ziegler, gunned down outside his garage. These weren't robberies. They weren't crimes of passion. They were thrill kills. Random, cruel, fast. Edward's job as a trucker made him nearly impossible to catch. He was always on the move, always crossing state lines. He had no single hunting ground. Every dark highway, every small-town backroad became his territory. Then, in June 1978, the cracks began to show. Police in Aliquippa stopped a suspicious vehicle. Behind the wheel was Edward Surratt. The car belonged to Luther Langford, a 66-year-old man who had just been murdered in Columbia, South Carolina. Langford's wife had barely survived the attack. She'd been beaten so viciously she needed reconstructive surgery. When officers tried to arrest Edward, he pulled a gun and fired warning shots. Then he vanished into an abandoned factory, triggering a multi-state manhunt. Inside the stolen car, investigators found blood-stained clothing, Langford belongings, and something even more damning. Items tied to the Weinman murders in Pennsylvania, including a baseball bat covered in Edward's fingerprints. The puzzle pieces started to click into place. Police now believed Edward Surratt was responsible for up to 18 murders across 3 states. But his killing spree wasn't finished. On July 1st, 1978, Volcano Beach, Florida, Edward broke into a quiet family home. Inside were 2 parents and their 15-year-old daughter. He beat the mother and father so savagely they could barely move. He sexually assaulted the daughter. And then, unlike all the other times, he made a mistake. Instead of fleeing, he stayed. He got high. He drank. And he passed out on their living room floor. The father, still barely alive, managed to untie himself, drag his broken body to the phone, and call the police. When officers arrived, the man they believed was the monster behind an entire interstate murder spree was lying unconscious on the carpet. Edward Arthur Surratt, once a soldier, now one of America's most terrifying killers, was finally in handcuffs. At trial, he pleaded guilty. The sentence, 2 life terms plus 200 years. But it didn't stop there. South Carolina extradited him. He was convicted again. 2 more life sentences. Then came the confessions. Edward admitted to killing John Shelkins in 1978 and assaulting Shelkins' wife. Pennsylvania authorities didn't bother prosecuting. They already knew Edward would never see freedom again. But for the families, it wasn't enough. For them, the damage was permanent. Empty chairs at dinner tables. Weddings without fathers. Children who grew up with no memories of their mothers' faces. Edward Surratt is still alive today, locked inside a maximum security prison in Florida. He will die there. He will never breathe outside air again. But there's a deeper truth. Some of his victims are still missing. Some cases were never fully solved. Investigators believe Edward killed more, possibly dozens more. He was a predator hiding in plain sight. A trucker with a clean shave, a polite smile, and a cab that doubled as a hunting ground. He turned America's highways into bloodstained trails. To this day, people in Pennsylvania still lock their doors before the sun goes down. Not because of what's outside now, but because of what once passed through. He was silent. He was smiling. And he was unstoppable until one night, in one house, a man decided to fight for his family. That single act of courage ended a trail of destruction that might have gone on for years. Justice was finally served. When Edward Surratt was finally locked away, the headlines focused on the numbers. How many murders, how many states, how many years he would spend behind bars. But numbers don't capture what he left behind. They don't show the way fear spread like smoke across small towns, how entire communities changed their lives because of him. In western Pennsylvania, people stopped leaving windows open at night. Hardware stores sold out of locks and deadbolts. Parents stopped letting their kids ride their bikes past dusk. Neighbors who used to borrow sugar from each other now kept their doors chained and curtains drawn. It wasn't just that a killer had been caught. It was the horrifying realization that for almost 2 years, he had been everywhere and nowhere at once. Truck stops that used to be places of casual conversation became tense. Strangers eyed each other differently. Every unfamiliar semi parked on the side of a highway suddenly felt like a threat, because Edward wasn't the kind of murderer people expected. He didn't lurk in one dark alley or haunt a single neighborhood. He was a drifter in plain sight, hiding in the very structure of America's roads. His job gave him a perfect disguise, constant motion. But behind the headlines, there were faces, families who would never be the same, like the Weinmans. Joseph Weinman was a disabled veteran who had survived a war, only to die violently in his own home. His wife, Catherine, had been tied up, beaten, and tortured before being killed. Their neighbors found them when newspapers began piling up on the porch. Inside, the house was a scene so brutal that some officers never forgot it. Blood pooled in the carpet. A baseball bat was snapped in half. A chair was overturned, its legs splintered. Catherine's sister later told reporters, "We thought they were safe there. They kept to themselves. They weren't rich. They didn't hurt anyone. And then this man, this stranger, came into their home and took everything." The Hamiltons were younger, just starting their lives. David worked construction. Linda was in nursing school. They had plans, small ones, simple ones. Saving up for a car. Talking about kids someday. They never made it that far. Police found them beaten to death in their bedroom. The walls streaked with handprints of their own blood. One investigator said it looked as if someone had dragged their hands across the wall, trying to get up, trying to crawl away. In Ohio, Guy and Laura Mills had been married for decades. They were the kind of couple who still held hands when they walked to church. Their neighbors noticed something was wrong when the Mills dog began howling, refusing to stop. Officers forced open the back door and found a silence that was heavier than any sound. Days had passed. The bodies were already decomposing. Even those who survived never truly escaped him. In South Carolina, Luther Langford's wife lived, but the attack left her with permanent scars and a face she barely recognized when she looked in the mirror. For months, she couldn't sleep through the night. Every creak in the house felt like footsteps. She later said in a deposition, "It wasn't just my husband he killed. He killed the life we had. He killed the person I used to be." Edward's violence wasn't random impulse. Investigators later realized it followed a pattern, one built on control and domination. He targeted homes at night. He struck fast and hard, overwhelming victims before they had a chance to fight back. When he tied people up, it wasn't just to keep them from escaping, it was part of the power. One FBI profiler described it simply. He didn't kill to cover a crime. The killing was the crime. The terror was the point. But why didn't anyone stop him sooner? Part of the answer lies in the chaos of the 1970s. Law enforcement databases weren't connected across states. DNA wasn't available. Even fingerprints took days to match. When a murder happened in Pennsylvania, Ohio police didn't automatically know about it. A homicide in South Carolina wasn't linked to one in Florida unless someone made the connection by hand, phone call by phone call, file by file. And Edward understood that. He kept moving, rarely staying in one place long enough to draw attention. When things got too hot in one state, he drove to another. If police started asking questions in a truck stop, he simply changed routes. What ultimately brought him down wasn't advanced technology. It wasn't a massive task force. It was one man, bleeding, broken, tied up in his own living room, who refused to let Edward leave alive. The father in Villano Beach never forgot that moment. He later told police that even as he lay there, ribs shattered, he kept thinking about his daughter. "I wasn't going to die in front of her. I wasn't going to let him kill her, too." When Edward passed out, the father inched his way to a table, knocked over a lamp, and found a shard of broken glass. With trembling hands, he cut through the ropes on his wrists. He crawled to the phone. He called 911, and within minutes, the monster that had haunted 3 states was unconscious on the floor, surrounded by police. Edward's arrest sent shockwaves through every community that had feared him. People poured into courtrooms, desperate to see the man who had changed their lives. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like any other man in his 30s, short hair, clean-shaven, plain clothes. If you saw him at a grocery store, you wouldn't think twice. But when prosecutors played tapes of his confessions, that changed. He described murders with no hesitation, no emotion. He talked about strangling, beating, and shooting people as if he were reciting a grocery list. One investigator later said, "You expect anger. You expect hate." But he didn't have that. It was worse. It was nothing. Just empty. The trial didn't take long. The evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, stolen property, survivor testimony, DNA from later testing. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. Guilty on every count. When the judge read the sentence, life without parole, plus 200 years, families wept. Some hugged. Some just stared at him, trying to memorize his face, trying to burn it into their memory as the last time they'd ever have to see him free. But even then, justice didn't feel complete. Some victims still didn't have names. Some bodies had never been found. Edward hinted there were more. He even admitted to police, "You don't know half of it." Even after Edward Surratt's sentencing, detectives across multiple states kept digging. They weren't just trying to close files. They were trying to give names to the unnamed, to pull the forgotten out of cold storage and tell their families the truth. In Pennsylvania alone, more than a dozen unsolved cases from the mid-1970s were reopened. They had similar patterns: couples killed in their homes, women beaten, men shot or bludgeoned. No clear motive, no robbery. Some of those files had sat untouched for years because the victims weren't wealthy or politically connected. They were ordinary people, and that's exactly why Edward had chosen them. In interviews, he never explained why he killed. He never offered a story of revenge or some twisted mission. Instead, when asked why them, he would just shrug. One detective who spoke with him decades later recalled, "He looked me straight in the eye and said, 'They were just there.' Like that was enough. Like that was all the reason anyone needed to die." This lack of motive was what terrified investigators the most. A killer with a pattern is dangerous but predictable. Edward wasn't predictable. He was opportunistic. Evidence teams revisited old crime scenes, though many were long gone. Houses had been torn down. Neighborhoods had changed. Some murder sites had been abandoned for years, now overgrown with weeds, their walls collapsing. In one case, police followed Edward's confession to a patch of woods in rural Ohio. They dug for 2 days and found fragments of human bones, too small and weathered to identify by sight. DNA testing later confirmed they belonged to a missing woman from 1977. For her sister, it was the first piece of closure she'd had in nearly 30 years. We always wondered if she ran away. We hoped she had. But deep down, I think we knew. Now at least we can bury her. Not every family got that chance. Edward hinted at others, but when pressed for details, he played games. Sometimes he would say, "Maybe I'll tell you tomorrow." Other times, he would describe a murder in vivid detail, but refused to say where it happened. One detective said he wanted control even from inside a prison cell. He wanted to keep those families in limbo, the same way he kept his victims powerless. In small towns across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and South Carolina, the fear didn't vanish just because Edward was behind bars. For years, rumors persisted. What if he didn't act alone? What if someone else learned from him? What if there are more bodies out there we haven't found? The unanswered questions kept people looking over their shoulders long after the manhunt ended. But the story of Edward Surratt isn't only about horror. It's about the people who refused to let him keep winning. Detectives who had been young rookies during his spree carried those unsolved cases for decades, refusing to close them as cold. Families refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. Some created foundations for victims' rights. Others wrote letters to lawmakers demanding better interstate cooperation between police departments. Even neighbors, people who had no direct connection to the murders, changed their communities. Neighborhood watch programs grew. People who had never owned guns before started taking safety classes. And then there were the survivors. Like the teenage girl in Villano Beach, the one Edward assaulted the night he was caught. For years, she didn't speak publicly about what happened. She changed her name. She moved to another state. But later, as an adult, she testified at parole hearings, not because Edward had any chance of getting out, but because she wanted it in the record. He doesn't deserve freedom. He doesn't deserve a second chance. My parents are still in pain every single day. I still have nightmares. He took something from me that I can never get back. The only justice is him dying in that cell. In 2018, more than 40 years after his arrest, investigators interviewed Edward again. He was in his late 70s now, frail but still cold. When asked if he regretted anything, he paused for a long time. Then he said, "I regret getting caught. Not the lives he took, not the families he destroyed. Getting caught." That statement was read aloud to victims' families. Some cried. Some shook their heads. Some simply said, "That's why he can never leave." Today, Edward Surratt is still alive, still breathing, still locked inside a concrete cell in Florida. He will die there, just another aging inmate surrounded by walls he'll never escape. And while that doesn't erase what he did, it does mean one thing. He will never hurt anyone again. For the people of Aliquippa, for the families across 3 states, that's the only justice left. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you haven't already, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We upload new true crime content daily, covering cases you know and many you don't. Stick with us as we bring you more stories that deserve to be heard. See you in the next video.